Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. It is so wonderful to see all of you. I'm Mackenzie Zadrali, Managing Director of Enrichment Programs with the Wisconsin Alumni Association. And on behalf of our organization, thank you so much for joining us for our Wisconsin Idea Spotlight program on the power of forgiveness with Robert Enright. We're really happy to be here in community with all of you. It really is truly, it brings us such joy, our team, to be able to connect with all of you. So thank you. I have just a few quick announcements and acknowledgments before we get started. So before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge that the Wisconsin Alumni Association and UW-Madison are situated upon traditional territories. The Wisconsin Alumni Association respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Right, and I also would like to give a special thank you to our sponsors for tonight's program, the Sandra G. Sponham Alumni Park Signature Program Series Fund, and to Capitol Lakes, Madison's premier not-for-profit continuing care retirement community. All right, as a reminder, I invite you to pull out your electronic devices, silence them, or just turn them off and just be present with us tonight out of respect for our fellow guest and speaker. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we have a wonderful program for you tonight. It was wonderful hearing you all talking. Really excited for our speaker. I'll just do one more logistical note. So we'll have Professor Enright speak, and then we'll do some Q&A. And during that portion, I, along with my colleague Lizzie, will have 2 microphones and come around for question and answer. We'll have microphones so that everybody can hear the question. So we'll look forward to that portion as well. All right, before I introduce our speaker, I just must say we are so lucky to have him here with us tonight. He has quite the speaking schedule right now, and we were just lucky to be able to have him join us this evening. He's been speaking across the country and abroad, and we're just really thrilled to have him with us tonight. So Robert Enright is the Aristotelian Professor in Forgiveness Science in the School of Education's Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As the pioneer of the scientific study of forgiveness, he focuses his research on moral development and the psychology of forgiveness. He has published several books on the subject, including Forgiveness is a Choice, a step-by-step process for resolving anger and restoring hope, Forgiveness Therapy, and The Forgiving Life. Some of Enright's research projects include Forgiveness Therapy, developing forgiveness educational materials for children, group forgiveness, and the Enright Forgiveness Inventory, a refinement of the scale of measure, the psychology of forgiveness. Enright is a popular speaker on the moral development of forgiveness, with his work appearing in such outlets as Time Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and ABC's 2020. Because of his discovery of the association between forgiveness therapy and the healing from trauma, he recently received what the American Psychological Association calls psychology's highest award, the APF Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Enright.
Well, thank you very much, Mackenzie, and thank you very much, Wisconsin Alumni Association, for putting up with me tonight. I'm honored to be here. And as you can see on the slide, we're talking about resentment. And we're talking about how to heal from resentment. Because quite frankly, most of us have been treated unfairly by others. Everyone in this room probably has a story to tell of some kind, and some of those stories would make us weep. And I know that because I have been studying the topic of forgiveness and heartbreak for 38 years. So since this is an important topic that touches the heart of virtually everyone in here, Here's going to be our objectives for this evening. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what we call unhealthy anger or resentment. It's an important challenge in mental health, physical health, and in interactions with other people. Then we're going to talk about forgiveness as the possible way of eliminating or at least reducing this unhealthy anger. But we then have to know what forgiveness is and is not. I do a lot of speaking, and I have found that most people don't really understand what forgiveness is. We use the term, we almost just have a natural sense of what we think it is, but most people actually misunderstand it. So that's a little bit of a challenge to all of us here. So I want to define forgiveness as an egghead professor who studied this thing from the ancient times to modern philosophy and psychology, and I'll do my best to make it as clear as I can. Then we're going to talk about the benefits of forgiveness for reducing this unwelcome guest in the human heart that I'm calling resentment. And then I'm going to show you a pathway of forgiving that we've used with a lot of different people in different kind of communities when the heart is broken to try and mend that heart. And then we're going to be talking about what I call the forgiving community itself, how to actually establish forgiveness within homes and schools and workplaces so that you can actually foster this idea of forgiving. So first of all, what's the difference between healthy and unhealthy anger? There is such a thing as healthy anger. Healthy anger usually occurs in a short term when someone treats you badly and you basically say, you don't have the right to treat me that way. Stop it. You are showing self-respect. You are showing a sense of justice. Anger is good in the short run. The problem is when that anger starts to dripping on your heart, and it's a faucet that doesn't have a plumber, and it keeps dripping on your heart. It's like the water falling on a stone, drip by drip by drip, over days and months and years. And what happens to that stone? It corrodes. It gets eaten away. And that's what I mean by unhealthy anger. The unhealthy anger is the dripping, dripping, dripping of the anger that has taken up residence in your heart, is an unwelcome guest, and doesn't know how to quit. That's the dangerous kind of anger. So we have to make that distinction. Anger is good. You don't have a right to treat me with unfairness, and I'm going to stand up to that. But that anger, if we don't get rid of it, can actually turn on us. So we have to be careful. Here's just one example of compromise with regard to the drip, drip, drip of the unhealthy anger in your heart that doesn't know how to leave. And this comes to us from Vidal-Ribos with looking at 24 different studies. So it's not just one idiosyncratic study, it's looking at it cumulatively. And let's look at the quote here. We found that irritability is the psychiatric word for unhealthy anger. Psychiatry is the medical doctor's mental health profession, okay? They tend to use the term irritability. We in psychology tend to use the word resentment or unhealthy anger or toxic anger, and they all mean the same thing. So we found that irritability forms a distinct dimension with, listen to this, substantial stability across time. Hear those words, substantial stability? That's the unwelcome guest that doesn't know how to leave the human heart, okay? Across time, and that it is specifically associated with what? Depression and anxiety in longitudinal studies over time. So with that drip, drip, drip of that anger that stays with you, that can actually eventually lead to anxiety, and depression, and a lot of discontent in your human heart, right? So we have to be able to do something about that, because they're saying it lasts for a long time. Here's one, a study that was done with regard to physical issues. And these researchers, Thomas and friends, found that extremely low levels of this irritability over time. Well, what does that mean, the low scores? It means you're fuming, but you stuff it. You're fuming, but you don't let it out. Because good people don't get angry, right? And so there's a tendency to deny that this irritability has taken up residence in your heart. You know what it's associated with? Some forms of cancer, right? And so we have to do something about this. Here's another one with physical changes, with the drip, drip, drip of toxic anger, unhealthy anger, or irritability. It can impact the immune system. A colleague of mine, Dr. Lee, and I did what we call a meta-analysis of many studies, and we found that. And this particular study by Hendricks and friends, they found that if you keep this kind of anger in your heart for a long period of time, it can impact the immune system. And I'm working with a colleague, a medical doctor in the United Kingdom, Pavel Katoček from Slovakia, who recently did a study with people with multiple myeloma cancer, a blood cancer that is connected with the immune system. And he screened them for those who had a lot of trauma from unjust treatment from others in their past. He helped them learn to forgive, and their symptoms of multiple myeloma evened out. Right? It's not a cure for it, but it's helping them with a better life, because the symptoms aren't continuing to climb. They're actually going down. And we see that unhealthy anger can now not just have an impact on psychological compromise or on physical compromise, but on interpersonal compromise. Here's just a few bullet points. When you have this kind of drip, drip, drip of unhealthy anger in your heart, you can rather easily start displacing that onto others, so that you can give that to loved ones, displacing the anger onto a partner or onto children, onto coworkers. It can be discouraging, second bullet point, for those who want to interact with you, because there's a tendency to push the other away. There can be a tendency to develop a norm of unhealthy anger in families or communities or workplaces, where it almost seems okay to be angry and to express this, and for all of us to put up with it. And it can actually lead to a breakdown in communities. I had a superintendent of schools on the West Bank of Israel come to me saying, would you please help me in our small community, because the anger in this community has built up to such a degree and is such long-lasting that it, and I'm quoting, is destroying individuals, families, and our community itself. Would you please come in and help us with the unhealthy anger that we have? Because even though they might have a case politically with others, political entities in the Middle East, the corrosive anger within there is actually hurting themselves. And so if that's the case, we've got to get a cure for this, everybody. We've got to find a way to get rid of, we've got to turn the faucet off, okay? We've got to turn that faucet off so that the heart isn't like the stone and eventually is corroded, because the one who has power over you by treating you unfairly is going to have extreme power over you, because you will have a destroyed heart that might be years and years later relative to the injustice in the first place. Talk about power over us, my goodness. It's not just power over us with the initial injustice, it is the effect of what now happens years later. And when people die from stress-related causes and the dripping and dripping and dripping of the anger in the heart, oftentimes medical professionals never make the connection between what happened 20 years ago and dying now. So it's hard to put those together, the injustice from the past and the effects that eventually destroy the person. I think there is a cure for this unhealthy psychological state, physical state, and interpersonal state. And I think it's forgiveness. That's why we have to pay attention to what it is. Okay? When you're treated unfairly by others and the resentments, the toxic anger, the irritability, call it what you will, build up, and we get the anxiety and the depression and low self-esteem, forgiveness can actually help change that and cure that. And I'm going to show you that. Okay? And it can actually give you a new, shall we say, lease on life and cooperation with others. Forgiveness, properly understood and practiced, if you want to do it, literally can give you your life back. Okay, that's the case. What do we mean by forgiveness? Remember my challenge. Most people with whom I speak don't really understand the word, but think they do because you've used the word a lot. Let's take a look at it. What do we mean by the term forgiveness? First of all, this is one thing I really like about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a choice. It's your choice to engage in forgiveness or not. And I hope no one will condemn you if you don't. And I hope no one will condemn you if you do. You see, some people will say, how could that person forgive that? That's just crazy. And so there's almost a condemnation if you do go ahead and forgive. Or others might say, you need to go ahead and forgive. It's good for you. What's wrong with you? No, neither one of those I think is reasonable. What's reasonable is you making your own decision, having thought about what forgiveness is, and going ahead because your own free will and rationality say, this seems right for me. Also, Aristotle's my buddy. As Mackenzie said, I hold what's called the Aristotelian professorship in forgiveness science. That's a mouthful. But the reason I have the Aristotelian professorship is because I lean on this ancient Greek philosopher for information as to what forgiveness is, because he has convinced me that forgiveness, like justice, patience, kindness, is a moral virtue. And I've never seen another philosopher from then to the present who's as clear and deep and precise in explicating what a moral virtue is that I've ever seen. That's why Aristotle is my teacher. That's why he's my pal. Right? And when he says that it's a moral virtue, what he's basically saying is it deals with goodness toward others. All moral virtues deal with goodness, deliberately cultivated, where you are willing to do it toward other people for their good. Justice is an example. Aristotle's teacher, Plato, wrote in the Republic that the key moral virtue for a healthy society is justice. And in modern parlance here, what we have for justice is this. If you contract with a carpenter for $100 to build you a table, and there's a yes to that on both sides, the carpenter builds you the table, you give $100. It's an equal exchange among persons. And that's good, rather than taking the table and running. That would be unjust. So that's one example of a moral virtue. Patience is another moral virtue, where you might be annoyed with someone as you're checking out and it's late and the cashier's slow. Having patience on that person who might have been standing there for 4 hours is a moral virtue. It's good to have patience toward those who are suffering. Forgiveness is good. It's good how? Well, when you take a look at the different philosophies and religions that have withstood the test of time, It is good in the sense you deliberately try to be good to those, gulp, gasp, somebody stop me here, to those who are not good to you. Whoa, talk about being a little controversial. You deliberately try to be good to those who are not good to you. Well, that seems like it flies in the face of justice, isn't it? Shouldn't we simply be standing there and asking something of that other person? It seems like we're setting up a doormat situation here. I'm now getting worried about what I study. What is this? This seems a bit odd. But the ancient texts, whether it's Hebrew, Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, all have an honored place for the idea of forgiveness. And basically, what's happening is you decide to have some kind of mercy toward those who have not been good to you. Right? The very first story ever written down in the history of humanity that I've ever seen is in the Hebrew scriptures. It's in Genesis 37 to 45, where Joseph forgives his half-brothers who threw him down a well to murder him, only to change their mind and pull him up. And instead of dusting him off and saying, "Come home, bro," they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And when the half-brothers came down years later and he was in charge there, he recognized them. They didn't recognize him. And he gave them, because they asked, provisions, animals, food to save the Hebrew nation. And so that's the first indication of someone who could have been enraged at the half-brothers, and he saved their nation by having mercy on them. He embraced them unconditionally. They didn't apologize. They didn't say, "Let's go to the peace table." They didn't even recognize him. And he, in his own largeness of heart, that's an Aristotelian term for forgiveness. He calls it magnanimity or largeness of heart. Joseph's largeness of heart actually helped save the Hebrew nation. That's how important forgiveness is. Right? I wonder what would have happened if he said, "No way, I'm not going to do this. Get out of here." And he didn't do that. He gave them the provisions that allowed them to go ahead well. So since then, there have been other stories and other ideas from the other religious and philosophical views. And I think if we had someone of the Jewish persuasion and the Christian and the Islamic and the Hindu and Buddhist and the atheist and the humanistic all sitting together around a table, I think the vast majority of them would agree with this definition of what forgiveness is, right? Because it's consistent with the ancient and the modern views of theology and philosophy and now psychology. 3 points. When you have been deeply hurt by others and treated unjustly, that's point 1, forgiveness centers on injustice. When that happens, number 2, you deliberately, it's willed by you, strive to get rid of the resentment toward the other person. You don't just take a forgiveness pill and now you're feeling good and you're relaxed in your hammock. No. It is to connect with the other, person to person, to try and get rid of the resentment. And then number 3 is where it blossoms into a moral virtue. You deliberately try to offer goodness of some kind to the one who hurt you. A smile, a return text, a meeting perhaps that you might have not had for years, even with a breakdown in the family. And you try to offer as best you can kindness, respect, generosity, or even love toward the other. Love would be the highest level. By love, I mean the ancient Greek word of agape, A-G-A-P-E. And we're not talking romantic love here. We're talking about effort that can be difficult for the sake of the other's good. That's what forgiveness actually seems to be. And there are a number of issues that forgiveness is not. And I bring these to you because Aristotle said when you're trying to understand a concept, always try to show how it is different from similar related constructs. Okay? So again, I'm learning from Aristotle, my teacher. There are at least 4 issues that are confused with forgiveness. It gets forgiveness into trouble. One is when you forgive, you don't excuse. When you forgive, it's from the position that what happened to you was unfair, is unfair, and will always be unfair. Your forgiving will never erase that. Right? You really don't forget. We use the term forgive and forget. We forgive, and I've noticed we remember in new ways. Where when we think about it, we don't have that rancor building up in our hearts anymore. We don't have that deep anger building up. We remember it, right? But it is in such a way that it's not affecting us to the degree it did. Another one that gets forgiveness into trouble all the time is confusing it with reconciliation, or when 2 or more people come together again in mutual trust. Reconciliation is not a moral virtue. 2 people have to come together in reconciling. Forgiveness is your individual response to deliberately be good to the other, even if the other still refuses to be good to you, in which case you won't reconcile. So to forgive doesn't mean to automatically reconcile. And I get in trouble all the time. People look at me with a bit of anger where they have to forgive me, and they say, "How dare you ask me to go back into that relationship that could kill me?" And my response is, but I'm not asking you to do that. You're actually confusing forgiving and reconciling, and I don't want you to do that. Forgiveness opens the door to reconciliation, but the other has to do the other's part if this is going to happen. And another big one that gets forgiveness into trouble all the time is people think in either or ways about these moral virtues of forgiving and justice. Well, if I forgive, I have to throw justice under the bus. Or if I seek justice, I can't forgive. No. Again, my buddy Aristotle tells me that you shouldn't appropriate any one moral virtue in isolation because it tends to distort that. Let forgiveness and justice grow up together. What does that mean? If you decide to forgive, ask something of the other person. Right? If someone keeps hitting you over the head with a frying pan, and you're really upset about that, and you decide to try and get rid of resentment and offer goodness to that person, you have an obligation to yourself to say, please stop hitting me over the head with the frying pan. Right? And so let them both grow up together, and then forgiveness isn't such a dangerous thing. If it's not reconciliation, then it's not such a dangerous thing. And in fact, maybe it might even be helpful. Let's take a look at some empirical scientific evidence. And I have spent the past 30 years doing randomized experimental and control group clinical trials with students, with people who are really hurting. I'll just go through 5 of them very quickly. First of all, Dr. Suzanne Friedman and I did a study with incest survivors in the 1990s, and the psychological literature at the time said, do not expect much psychological healing for incest survivors. Psychotherapy is not strong enough to actually be able to heal that. Don't expect too much. It would be unethical of you as a mental health professional to have high hopes for incest survivors. Dr. Friedman worked one-on-one with 6 brave incest survivors, all women, all adults, who basically said, I don't think I'll forgive. Do you really want me in the study? They were being kind to her. She said, yes. She worked with them until each one of them said, I have forgiven. And it took about a year, one-on-one, for about an hour, for about 54 weeks. The control group could seek psychotherapy as they wished. At the end of that time, those who were in the forgiveness group came to us clinically depressed. That's a lot of pain to be clinically depressed. And they went to non-depressed status. See, they didn't just improve in depression, the depression left. What about the control group that didn't really have forgiveness therapy at all yet? They were still clinically depressed. They then went through the forgiveness program, and about a year later, they were clinically non-depressed. They went to non-depressed status. And what about the first group? Now, they had a whole year without forgiveness therapy. They were still non-depressed. Strongest results ever published with regard to incest survivors. Dr. Gail Reed and I worked with women who were divorced for at least 2 years. And in that time, remember, there could be a lot of healing going on, and it was very abusive marriages. They had 2 years after divorce, and they came to us still clinically depressed. Right? She worked with them for about roughly 30 weeks. It varied again. She worked with them as Dr. Friedman did. And they went down to non-depressed status, post-traumatic stress symptoms, ended up leaving. And you know who they ended up liking? Themselves. Because you know one thing I find when that drip, drip, drip of anger in the heart starts corroding that heart, you know who you end up not liking? Sadly, yourself. Okay? I wish the world didn't work that way. That seems just not right somehow. But forgiveness recaptured in these women their own sense of their own self-worth. We worked with men on a cardiac unit of a hospital. Did you know when there's cardiac compromise and you get really angry, the arteries to the heart can start to narrow? And when we asked these men to recall their stories of deep hurt because we screened them for that, that in fact happened. And when those who had forgiveness to forgive those who abused them in the past told their story of deep hurt 10 weeks after the program ended, when they told their story of deep hurt, the arteries stayed open. Dr. Douglas Russell, who oversaw this, said, we helped them avoid sudden death and chest pains. Right? It's the first study to show, listen to this, a cause and effect relationship between learning to forgive and the improvement of a major organ of the human body. Right? Forgiveness, which seems so abstract, you can't touch it and taste it and smell it and see it, actually had an effect on the beating heart. Right? It took 10 weeks after the program for that to develop. It wasn't immediate, but it happened. And then we have with us here tonight Dr. Mary Hansen, with whom I worked. And she did a seminal study with people who were dying in hospice, all women. They were dying of cancer. And instead of having a long program because they were weakened and their physical indicators were going down, she put them through a 4-week program. And while their physical issues were going down, their forgiveness of family members in the past that could have gone back literally decades. Some of them were forgiving people from decades ago, and it was still in the heart. And they forgave. And you know what surprised me about this one? You know what was going up? Their hope for the future. They're dying, and their hope for the future is going up. Why? Dr. Hansen told me, because she asked them, quite a few of them drew their family members together at their bedside. And they literally had a reconciliation that they hadn't had in years. And the women knew they were leaving their family in a better situation than would have been the case had they not forgiven. Dr. Hansen, thank you. She helped them to die well. Right? And one we just recently finished was with men in a maximum security correctional institution. It was 33% African American, 33% mixed race, and the others were varied. And they all came to us clinically angry, anxious, and depressed. We put them through a 6-month intervention on forgiveness, and I'll show you in a minute that pathway. And they all went to non-clinical status of anger, anxiety, and depression. And the control group had the hand-picked intervention by the Department of Corrections. You'd think that'd work pretty well. They were still clinically angry, anxious, and depressed. They then went through the forgiveness program and they went to non-depressed status, non-anxious status, non-anger status. Unfortunately, we didn't make the Department of Corrections protocol look too great, okay? We haven't been asked back in again. I might have to forgive somebody for that, but that's another story, okay? But we are doing our best to get in here and in Belfast, Northern Ireland. But when you take a look at all of that, I think you see that forgiveness matters in a way that in the entire history of psychotherapeutic science, it had been hidden. People weren't aware of this because we had the privilege here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to literally do the very first scientific studies ever done on the topic of forgiveness. Forgiveness, about 100 years after the inception of the invention of psychological science. How could it remain hidden for so long? And yet when we started doing this, we were seeing a connection. And I was thinking, forgiveness, where have you been all the life of the psychological sciences? But at the very least, we have it now. So with that in mind, here's the pathway. How do people forgive? I'm only going to be sharing with you our pathway. We call it the process model of forgiveness. There are other pathways, but this one is the one that has the empirical science I just went through. First of all, when I'm working with a client, I will ask the person to choose one person with whom that person is angry because of unjust treatment. It's usually one at a time. And if this client has 10 people at whom the client is fuming, I say, don't start with the highest. Okay, start with someone lower so you get to know the pathway. Okay, so you get to become, as I say, forgivingly fit over time. And be sure there was an injustice there, saying, yes, I'm sure I didn't confuse anything. So when you have the one person in mind, kind of lower on your hierarchy, we have 4 phases. And the first phase is what we call uncovering your anger. We do not go back to the injustice and put it under a microscope. It happened and there's nothing more we can do about it. We examine here the effects of the injustice. And people are oftentimes oblivious to the fact that there are a lot of effects that have tumbled into this person's psychological health of which that person is unaware. And here's some. One is actually first denying the amount of anger, denying the amount of resentment. And it takes time, once you develop the therapeutic bond, for a person to actually trust the mental health professional and say, you know, I'm angrier than I thought. When we put it on a 1 to 10 scale, the person at first says 5, it might go up to an 8 or a 9 or a 10. And while that can be painful, if it's true, it's not re-traumatizing. It's looking at what's there. It's looking at what's there now. We oftentimes see shame because when you've been treated very unfairly by others, there's a tendency for others to whisper about, well, what did you do to be a part of this? Because it usually takes 2 to have difficulty and conflict. No, not always. So there's a tendency for people to judge you when you've been treated unjustly. That itself is another effect that you don't deserve. The most frequent health complaint I get is fatigue. See, with that drip, drip, drip of the resentment in the human heart, there is that tendency to be tired. When you're carrying this around for days, months, weeks, and years, it can be years, you can be tired. And you know what? You don't deserve that. That's another effect. You see how the injustice can be compounded by more injustices? You don't deserve the resentment. You don't deserve the shame. You don't deserve the fatigue. And you don't deserve the 4th bullet point here a changed worldview that is oftentimes very pessimistic, where people drift into a world philosophy that generalizes toward others, such as no one can ever be trusted. Everyone is only out for that person's own self-interest. Relationships, meaningful relationships, forget it. It's always one-sided. I'm going to be hurt again. You see, the person ends up with a philosophy of life that isn't helping the person who carries that philosophy because it's not necessarily true. There can be other people out there who truly want to love you, who want to be good to you, but you are at arm's length because your philosophy says no one can be trusted. Our second phase that probably will emerge, it can emerge a month later, because sometimes it takes a while to get through all these effects and to accept them as real. Right? We then hit the decision phase. This is where your rationality and free will come in. Do you want to walk the forgiveness path? Yes or no? Okay? And if you do, we go through the definition again. You've been treated unjustly. You will be trying deliberately to get rid of the resentment toward the other. And you will, gasp, gulp, try to be good to that other. You won't be excusing. You won't forget. You'll remember in new ways. You may or may not reconcile, and you won't be throwing justice under the bus. Do you want to do it? People oftentimes say yes because they've tried everything under the sun to heal, and it hasn't worked. Right? Remember the Department of Corrections hand-picked manual. It didn't work. Okay? And so when people do that, we usually give a homework assignment. When you leave the therapeutic encounter today, please try to commit to 3 little words: do no harm. Try to deliberately do no harm to the other. If you notice, I'm not asking you to embrace the person as Joseph did his half-brothers. I'm not asking you to give provisions to save a nation. I'm simply asking to refrain from the negative. That's actually a big step forward. And then when a person has made the free will decision to forgive, we then do the work phase. And the work phase, I call it hitting the forgiveness gym. We're going to hit the forgiveness gym, everybody. We're going to hit the forgiveness weights. And we're going to become forgivingly fit. And I use that as an analogy because this idea of becoming forgivingly fit is not so simple as to do 2 push-ups, 3 sit-ups twice a week for 2 weeks and you're done. It is a progression over time with effort and some suffering even. As they say in the physical fitness world, no pain, no gain. And that's kind of what it's like to walk the forgiveness path. Is that unjust to say you have to engage in some kind of suffering to get rid of your suffering? I say no. If you have a sore knee that requires surgery, isn't that painful itself? And isn't the surgery of the knee painful with rehab? Yes, it is. But what's worse, the temporary pain of the surgery and rehab or limping for the rest of your life? And it's a similar kind of way with forgiveness. So when we hit the forgiveness gym, we start with thinking, not feeling, because our feeling, our softened heart toward the other takes time. Thinking can be mastered more easily, and we have 3 kind of approaches that we call personal, global, and cosmic perspectives. The personal perspective asks you to look carefully at the one who hurt you as a person who has walked a historical path in life with other people who have probably pushed that person down, probably have wounded that person. And we usually know the one who hurt us because those who hurt us the most are those we know, particularly family members, because they're not supposed to hurt us. That's why hurt within families can run so deeply, you see, okay? And we ask, think of the times that this other person has been wounded by others, carrying around some confusion, carrying around some bewilderment, carrying around some anger, and that person dumped the truck of anger onto you. Is that true? And so you get to know the person's history of detailed issues of woundedness. And then we go to the global perspective, which is to see, this is based roughly on Martin Buber's, he's a philosopher, philosophy of personalism, to see a full, true, genuine human being, to see a person in front of you. Each person, the philosophy of personalism tells us, is special, unique, and irreplaceable. There will never be another human being like you on the planet ever. There will never be another person like the one who hurt you on the planet ever. You share humanity. If you cut, you bleed. If that person cuts, that person will bleed. You'll pass away one day, that person will pass away one day. You both have unique DNA, unless you're identical twins, but even those are different because of experiences. You share with the one who hurt you, being special, unique, and irreplaceable. Plus, you share woundedness, a history of being bumped by others and pushed by others. And only if a person has a spiritual perspective do we go to the cosmic perspective. Right? The cosmic perspective would be based on the person's own faith base, whatever that is. And as a mental health professional, I have an obligation to know what that is. Someone just ordered a pizza. And I actually had that on silent. I don't get it, but that's okay. Can you forgive a phone? You cannot forgive a phone because it's not a person. Forgiveness is about person. So thank you for that education, phone, for that, okay? Okay. And so for the cosmic perspective, what you would do is work with the person's own theological understanding. For example, let's go back to another Jewish example like I did with Joseph. If a person is a Jewish client, I would ask, is it true that we are all made in the image and likeness of God? And that's in Genesis 1 and repeated there. And so a Jewish person, and a Christian person too, by the way, would have to answer yes to that. We're all made in the image and likeness of God. So once they've gotten this far of seeing the wounds in the other and the shared humanity, you have to ask, then, is it true, drum roll please, that the one who hurt you is made in the image and likeness of God? And at that point, some clients say, oh, I wish I didn't know that, because it's kind of hard, but it takes time, and that's what I mean about becoming forgivingly fit, okay? It takes time to grow into these kind of images. But once they do, what you start seeing is a little bit of a softening of the heart. And what I mean by that is that drip, drip, drip of the resentment starts to slow down. And the heart now becomes stronger to be able to allow a little bit of compassion for someone who's suffering and for someone who shares a common humanity with you and someone who shares being made in the image and likeness of God with you. And when you put that whole story together, you know what you're doing when you're forgiving? You're expanding your story of who the person is beyond the injustice against you. Because we tend to stereotype the person as no good, dangerous, terrible, always doing this, disrespecting me or whatever. But there is more to the person than that, which means there is more in your heart to receive regarding that person than that. And when your heart starts softening a little bit, we then ask the person in the third bullet point to what we call accept the pain. It's similar to what hospice does when you're grieving after the loss of a loved one. Hospice tells you to lean into the pain. Don't run from it. Stand up to it and lean in. Well, that's what we do. We say, bear the pain for the other so you don't throw the pain back to that person or displace it onto others. You know what happens when a person does that and is strong enough to do that, having gone through the cognitive and the magnanimity of heart, the softness of heart? As the person stands up, the person realizes, hey, I'm stronger than I thought I was. You know, I can take this. I'm not going to be crushed by this. And now I can be a conduit of good for this person by not dumping the truck of anger on the person. And that's when we go to the punchline of forgiveness as a moral virtue and say, if you're ready, not everyone is, to go to this fourth point, even just getting to the first three can be very curative. We say, can you do something good for the other? The smile, the return phone call, a kind word about the person to others if you can't reconcile. You can even forgive the deceased person in your life by, for example, donating some money to a charity in the person's name and going through all of this with the person who's deceased. And it takes time. And then we hit the fourth phase, which we call the discovery phase. And in the discovery phase, what we have is learning. First of all, we realize we have found meaning in our suffering. And you know what most of the meaning is for people? They're now much more sensitive to the wounds in others. They're much more sensitive to the wounds in themselves and how the effects have changed their life and needs to change around a little more. The person seems to be more sensitive to the fact that we are all the walking wounded. You and I and everybody else are all part of the walking wounded, and your having suffered through the injustice of others and walked this path makes you more sensitive to that. Oftentimes people discover a new purpose in life. I was working with a gentleman who was in a medium security correctional institution. He's never getting out. He's there for life. He said, I know I'm not getting out, but I have a new purpose in life, having gone through this. And it is to help my cellmates to get rid of their wounds. And that's what I'm going to do in life. And I thought, well, good for you. Okay? And then you discover the freedom of forgiveness. Instead of living with these effects for the rest of your life, you realize you have had a rebirth, if you will, where the anger goes down, the anxiety goes down, the depression goes down, and your willingness to engage with other people goes up. So what do we do then with regard to forgiveness in our lives? Well, you can practice it individually, but you can also think about incorporating forgiveness into communities. That's one of our big research projects right now. We are starting this in Burundi, Africa, and South Africa that have known cycles of war for a very long time. And we are trying to do the following. We are trying to develop forgiveness as a norm in these communities. That forgiveness is something like justice is a norm in every society. Coming here, most of you drove a car and you behaved in obedience to the norms of justice of driving, right? You can now have norms of forgiveness where you can set aside time deliberately in a family to talk 10 minutes a week if you want and use teachable moments, like if someone had a bad day or if there's a film you're watching or something on the news, and talk about, well, what would have happened if someone tried to not dump the truck of hatred on others in this way, right? Companies can do the same thing, where they can have forgiveness. Human relations can send out memos with the idea of forgiveness at times. I'm working with a hospital in Nazareth in Israel for this very reason. They want to turn the hospital into a forgiving community, okay? Twist my arm, you better believe I'm going to work with them on that. And you can do this also with classrooms. We have forgiveness education programs from pre-kindergarten to grade 12, and we've given these away in 30 different world communities. Right? It cost us $1 million over 12 years to develop these. And I'm a terrible businessman. We now give them away for free, okay? $1 million free. I'm glad I'm a professor and not a head of a company. I think they'd go bankrupt, okay? And so I want to leave you with one thought. What will be your legacy in this life when you pass on? Will you leave your anger and the drip, drip, drip from your heart so that your children's 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 children will also have that kind of drip, 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 because you've passed it on to children who've passed it on to grandchildren who've passed it on to great-grandchildren? Do you realize your anger can be alive and well and in the hearts of family members 100 years from now? But if you walk a forgiveness path and become forgivingly fit and stop the dripping from that faucet of resentment, do you realize you actually could leave a legacy of love, again, agape love, which is in service to others even though it's difficult, so that that love in your heart that you have cultivated in becoming forgivingly fit can be alive and well in your grandchildren's grandchildren? There are two paths you can go by here. Which one will you choose? Forgiveness is a choice. Leaving love is a choice. And with that, I'd like to stop and entertain your questions, doubts, difficulties, or anything at all.
Thank you so much, Professor Enright. That was wonderful. If you have a question, we have 2 microphones. You can raise a hand. We'll come around and give you the mic so everyone can hear the question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jessica Zappia, and what encouraged me to come here today was I had you as a professor 30 years ago.
Wow, you're dating me. I'll never forgive you for that. Oh no, this is being recorded. I will forgive you. I will.
No, I loved having you as a professor in educational psychology of adolescence, and I believe I was an adolescent when I took the class. But I remember you speaking of forgiveness 30 years ago, and I'm an educator, and as my husband is as well, we teach middle school and high school, and we see our students here in Madison filled with trauma.
Yes.
And I would be really curious to hear more about how you see this in education, because our kids are really hurting.
I think that's a hugely important question. So let's just ask a fundamental question. What is the purpose of education? Is the purpose of education to help the little ones to survive and even thrive in adulthood? Yes. That's why we ask them to learn how to read or to balance a checkbook and know about math. Okay? The one thing we haven't done yet, the analogy is like with the psychological sciences, who didn't see this for 100 years. Education has yet to see that one of the main purposes is to prepare children for the grave injustices that are likely to visit them when they are adults, or to carry the trauma that they had in childhood into partnerships. And that is not fair to the partner. Think of it, of 2 people partnering, both of whom have been gravely wounded at age 6. How's that partnership going to go? Isn't part of education to learn how to deal with the injustices of life so that we can, when it comes, at least know how to deal with it? We can't build a perfect world where the point of forgiveness education is to avoid injustice, because that's not our call. Remember, that's the call of the others being mean to us. But if we know how to hit the forgiveness gym, we're going to be better off. I worked with a woman who was 35 years old, who's 2 children, and she didn't have a job. She was a homemaker, and her husband just up and left, abandoned her. And she said to me, I wish I had learned how to forgive as a child, because now I have to do it from scratch with 2 children, and I've got to get a job, and it's going to be so much harder. Wouldn't it be the same if all of a sudden now she has a bank account and doesn't know how to add and subtract the numbers? But we get her ready for that. Why, oh why do we not help get children ready for the traumas or the healing from the traumas that happen in childhood? Honestly, I don't understand that. I'm extremely frustrated by that. I go around the world twice a year to war-torn areas, for example, Galilee, Belfast, Northern Ireland, and the like, for this very reason. Okay, and we are able, and I'm so glad, to plant some of this, but I'm greedy. We're not doing enough Okay, we're in 24 schools in the Philippines. I want 200. Okay, why? Because of what I just said. So if you can help those children, those middle schoolers, get ready for the traumas of adulthood, I'm with you and I'd like to work with you on it. Others?
I am curious if you would share your thoughts on the challenge of forgiving that person who continues to hurt and offend you and treat you unjustly.
That is a very important question, and I actually get it a lot, which means that it happens frequently. And it happens frequently, oftentimes in a partnering relationship, where there are like disrespectful comments, as an example, that occur 10 times a day, every day for 5 years. Right? Then the question I tend to get is, isn't it the case that you forgive enough and you reach a certain point, then you just don't forgive anymore? My response to that is no. You have the harder challenge because it's happening frequently. So you have to bear down on forgiveness daily. And so I recommend, as you get out of bed in the morning, start cultivating the forgiving heart and the just heart. Right? Don't just cultivate the forgiving heart and say, okay, I'm going to keep forgiving and be silent, because that's not allowing justice to grow up. But from the point of a forgiving heart, the way you ask for justice will be very different than if you're fuming with hatred. Because if you're fuming with hatred, what you will ask for might be way beyond just justice. Okay? So forgiveness first, though, from the heart, so that the words you use might be gentler, but also very wise. And yes, it's a challenge, but so is rotator cuff surgery, which is harder than knee surgery, okay? And so you've got a rotator cuff tear, a complete tear. And so you're going to be in rehab for, it takes about 6 months to rehab a complete tear of a rotator cuff. You've got a torn heart, and that's going to require a lot, but ask something of that person in a way that is civil, kind, and to the degree possible, loving. And with perseverance, that's another moral virtue, persevering, maybe you will get that person's attention. And you know what? It's in that person's best interest to listen to that, because when you're motivated to be good to someone else, it really is a tragedy if the other doesn't see it and take advantage of that. So persevere, don't give up, but ask something of the person. We have one back here. Oh, over here? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Towards the very end of the presentation, you made a reference to what companies could do. And I think that's very significant, because I was wronged very significantly by an employer about 23 years ago. And I find it very hard to even think of forgiving them because of the ugliness that was involved.
Yep.
And because there's really no mechanism to forgive them, even if I wanted to,
Sure.
because they have so little accountability.
Yep.
And they can still raise the Nuremberg defense that they were just following orders from higher up. And they have so little accountability that I can't run to the criminal justice system, for example, to seek redress. So I find that to be a very difficult example of where forgiveness would be possible, even if I were so inclined. I also had a brief question for you. I was curious, is this work that you're doing in the prisons in Belfast, is that among prisoners that are there because of involvement in the sectarian and political disorders in Northern Ireland? Thank you.
Yeah, let's start with that last one, because it's an easy answer. Yes. Okay. There is that, but plus everything else with the fallen world we have, theft and drugs and everything else. But yes, the sectarian violence, although you don't hear about it anymore, is there to a degree. It has definitely gone down significantly since what they called the Good Friday Peace Accord in 1998. We started working there in 2002, and it was much worse. There were British soldiers with army fatigues and assault rifles on a lot of the street corners, and that's gone now. The government of the United Kingdom has pulled out. So it's better. And I'm thankful for that. But with regard to the other issue, even if those who have hurt you in your company are not accountable, even if those who've hurt you say, "What do you mean? You're overreacting." Even if they deny the wrongdoing, and you have looked at this carefully and rationally, and you say, "Yes, it is wrongdoing, but now they're using their power over me, not power for you, power over you," you still can, and I would encourage you to forgive no matter what the response is. In other words, I would challenge you to what I call unconditional forgiveness, just like Joseph did with his half-brothers. They didn't say we're accountable. They didn't write a note of apology, nothing. Who knows if they would have even said they were accountable if he asked them, but he didn't give them time to do so. Why would I urge you to unconditionally forgive them rather than waiting for them to shape up? Simply this: they have a lot of power over you, and you can release that power by forgiving them for what they've done. And then if you're still working there, work as best you can within the system. Even if you don't get justice, you would at least not have those people continuing that power over you that you could still have in 10 years. So you could actually be set free from these effects of saying, "Darn it, there's no accountability, they've hurt me." You might have even had to leave the job and you're fuming, okay? Now you have the drip, drip, drip in the heart. Forgiveness will help turn that off and have nothing to do with what happened in the past, but might, as we talked about with the partnering situation here, might help you in the future to talk with someone there to get redress, to get some kind of equity, if you will. And even if that does not come, stopping that drip, drip, drip in the heart might be hugely worth it if and when you're ready. What do you think of that? I don't want to have the last word on that. Do you want to follow up on that with what I just said?
In my case, I have no longer worked.
Okay.
Relative to
Okay. Yep.
they were using.
Okay. Yep.
I understand what you're saying, but it's
Yes.
very difficult.
It's very difficult. Yes, because not only did they treat you badly, you had to make a change in lifestyle. You had to make a change in career, which makes it a very grave offense. But very grave offenses are such that the person who engaged in those can still be offered forgiveness by this pathway if and when you're ready. And at the very least, you won't be carrying that resentment with you. You'll still look back and say it shouldn't have happened. You can still look back with some anger, but the difference is between some anger and the irritability is it's no longer controlling you. Okay?
Hi, thanks for your time. You seem to be a person who has done a lot of research. You mentioned that you've heard like practically every bad thing that could possibly happen to someone. So I'm
Yes.
wondering, for you, what is that like to be exposed to every trauma that you've experienced? And
Okay, what's it like for me to be exposed to every possible trauma? Like, for example, I was friends with Eva Moses Core. There's a film called Forgiving Dr. Mengele, where she was one of the twins at Auschwitz. And they had experiments on both of them, and her sister Miriam died because of that. And I became friends with Marietta Yeager, who went on a camping trip to the West, and her daughter Susie was abducted and sexually abused and murdered. Okay, and in both cases, they have forgiven. Okay, so I do walk the path of this kind of evil, if you will, and it has become part of my life. And I do the best I can to cope with that because I know there is a way out, you see. Just as with Dr. Hansen's hospice patients, they increased with hope. I have a lot of hope for all of these. So the hope in my heart is a coping mechanism. And hope, it really is a good thing to help you keep going. And we found even in the maximum security correctional institution, the one thing we did not have to change in the men was their sense of hope, because it was already high. Most of them were in for life, but hope cultivated in their heart, and that kept them alive. My hope is seeing these kind of results, knowing we can do something about it. Otherwise, there could be despair, when you think of all of this. But when you see cure, where the psychological sciences would see no cure before, I say, hey, let's keep hitting the forgiveness gym and the hope gym. So the hope gym is also important. So thanks for that very interesting question. I hadn't quite thought about that before until you asked it. Well, there you go.
Excuse me, I saw up there on the board at one point a title of a book that I believe you had written, and I didn't get it written down
okay.
fast enough.
Okay.
What was the title of that?
Well, I have 3 self-help books, 2 published by the American Psychological Association, and 1 by Norton in New York City. And the first one is called Forgiveness is a Choice. And it was deliberately written that way so people don't feel compelled, pressured, to forgive. Forgiveness is a choice. Then my next one was actually a higher level book than that. That one actually goes through the process model. Then I wrote one which is a Socratic dialogue between 2 women, and it's called The Forgiving Life, which holds up the idea of trying to recultivate love in the family through practice of forgiveness and then passing it on to others in the family. And so it does go through the process model, but with a much higher challenge. To listen to the title, The Forgiving Life, you cultivate forgiveness as an identity, as a part of who you are, as a part of your family community. And then the third one, which we actually used recently in the Maximum Security Correctional Institution, is called 8 Keys to Forgiveness. 8 Keys to Forgiveness. It was an 8-key series. And so they asked me to do this, and I said, 8? I called them up and said, 8 keys to forgiveness. We've got about 15 to 20. Can I change the title? And they said, forget it, buddy. It's 8 keys. They're nothing. So I gave them 8 keys. And it got published. So there you go. I probably had to forgive them a little bit for reducing my ambition, but that's another story.
Thank you. When you were talking about the phase 3, working on forgiveness, one of the things you mentioned was the giving of a gift.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could expand on that with some examples and what we're trying to accomplish when we do that.
Okay. What you're trying to accomplish when you give a gift is to recognize the unique humanity in the other as a person worthy of something good. So you concretely think about giving something good that would be reasonable and appropriate for that particular person. Right? And so if the person, likes concerts, you might bring the person to a concert. If the person is just simply, kind of reluctant to be with you, maybe sending an email that's kind. So I know we haven't talked for a long time, but I just want to let you know that I value you as a person. That would probably surprise that person, but delight that person, you see. And so you are giving a gift of acknowledging that person's humanity, or in the case of the concert, giving that person something pleasant that is of interest to that particular person. So you have to think creatively as to what that is. And it's going to definitely depend on who the other is, and how do you think this person would respond? Because you don't want to, for example, give the person the gift of saying, I forgive you, if the person's going to get all bent out of shape about that. Because that can happen, because the person will say, what did I didn't do anything, you're overreacting. You're You're accusing me. You see, so you don't want to necessarily go and give a gift of the words, I have forgiven you, although some people desperately want to hear that, and because they've asked. And if they say, I'm sorry, I've thought about it, I did wrong, would you please, when you're ready, forgive me? And you use those words, you're acknowledging what's in that person's own mind and heart. And so that's the gift. It is acknowledging the specialness of that person, the humanity of that person, and the paradox of forgiveness. A paradox is an apparent contradiction that is not a contradiction. As you reach out in goodness to the one who doesn't deserve it from a justice point of view, that's when the healing really begins to happen in your heart, because that giving does something very positive for that corrosive dripping of the resentment. Does that make sense, or would you like to follow up with something? Make sense? Okay.
Okay, we have time for just one last question. I'm sorry, I'm sure we could be here all night.
I feel bad being the last one. So I've had the fortune of interviewing a lot of combat veterans in my classroom, mainly Afghanistan, Iraq, mainly kids that I've seen before and after. And it seems to me most of their post-traumatic stress comes from within. Their anger is to themselves. So how does one go by the forgiveness of themselves? Is that a different way about it? Because that's what I see with a lot of these combat veterans. Thank you.
Very interesting question about forgiving oneself with the combat veterans. And again, I have had conversations about that where people see so much or they've done so much. And I see the exact same thing when I work in the correctional institutions, where I'll talk about forgiveness. And remember, that was about forgiving those who've traumatized them. And we deliberately chose those who were traumatized by others. But when I talk, and I don't do the therapy there, it's the counselors in the institution who do it. I simply train them to do that. But when I speak, which is not infrequently in the correctional institution, many of the men will wait for everyone else to leave. They'll look over their shoulder, because you can't show weakness in a maximum security correctional institution. And they'll whisper to me, how can I forgive myself for what I've done? Right? And here's my response to that. You have the book, 8 Keys to Forgiveness, and should be more than that, but we're not going to go there, okay? And you know the pathway toward another person. And it's good that you have walked the path with another person, because we tend to be harder on ourselves than we are on others. So even if someone comes to me and say, my task and my only task is to forgive myself, we don't start there. We usually start with picking someone out in their life and walking the pathway of forgiveness so they get to know it. They get to see what it means to expand their story about the other, about being open to a little bit of compassion for the other, about seeing the humanity of the other, about bearing the pain for the other so you don't subvert the other. And then I say, now apply that to yourself. So what you're trying to do is expand the story of yourself. You are not entirely defined by your errors of the past, right? And some people will never let themselves off the hook. You are more than that. You have to expand your story as to who you are. Have you never been kind to anyone else in your life? Of course you have. So have all those in the maximum security correctional institution. And so have those who've been in the military issue, right? You can then stand in the pain so you do not subvert yourself. Many people who have self-loathing because they have not self-forgiven do subvert themselves with drugs, lack of sleep, excessive food consumption, whatever it is, or not being kind to others in relationships where they're constantly subverting their own relationships. When you stand in the pain, you don't do that anymore. And what you have to do is you have to give yourself the gift of recognizing your own humanity. And that takes time, and you have to be gentle with yourself, but it happens. Okay? Self-loathing, I'm glad you asked the question. It's a very big deal. I'm a blogger for Psychology Today magazine. Okay? And I wrote a blog on self-loathing, and I was surprised. I don't remember now how many, but it was like 40,000, 50,000 hits. I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of self-loathing. It made me, it made me sad, to think about that. And it surprised me because I wasn't quite ready for that. But walk the pathway with another so you start knowing what it means to become forgivingly fit, then apply it to yourself, and it definitely works. Thank you for putting up with me.
Please join me in thanking Professor Robert Enright for the wonderful, wonderful program. We needed this, right? Thank you to all of you for your questions and for joining us tonight. And I just want to give a couple other thanks to our program team. There's a team of people who helps put these programs on. So to Lizzie, Allie, Joe, Melissa, Carrie, Bryson, please forgive me. I'm certain I'm forgetting someone, but thanks to everybody who helped put these programs on, and thanks to our sponsors. And Stephanie and Sam. And I also want to mention that this summer, we hope to see you at the Alumni Association. We do Badger meetups every Friday. We're right on the lakefront, and from 1 to 4 p.m. We'd love to see you to come out. There's refreshments, connection with fellow alums, and boat rides for WAA members. So hopefully we can see you again this summer at those programs. And if you want to learn any more about these programs, excuse me, Professor Enright, you can always visit our website. But thank you so much for coming out tonight. It was wonderful to see all of you. Thank you again to Professor Robert Enright. Wonderful.